Welcome to So-and-So, brought to you by Bernina, made to create. I'm Meg Goodman, and you're about to enjoy a casual conversation with a special member of the sewist and quilting community. A conversation about how they got started, what inspires them, what excites them, and their connection to this community. Our guest today is George Kalajian, a world-renowned couture master craftsman located in New York's Garment District. George is the owner-operator of Tom's Sons International Pleating, which was founded more than 50 years ago by his grandfather. In addition to running his company, he's also the author of the book Pleating, Fundamentals for Fashion Design. Born in Lebanon and moving to the U.S. when he was 5 years old, after working for his father for a time, he went off on his own and worked in technology, as a teacher, and as a bartender. Coming back to the family business, George has worked with myriad designers, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and on many TV shows, films, and Broadway plays. George traces his family's involvement in the business back 150 years to his great-great-grandfather, Krikor Tutounjian, who owned a fabric factory in Turkey. There is a long, beautiful story of the passing of skills from one generation to another, and, well, we'll let George tell us this one. Hi, George, and welcome to So-and-So.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
You know, we're having kind of a different conversation today. It's not technically sewing, but pleating is something that I actually learned about in preparing for our conversation, and it is critical to a finished garment, and we're going to talk all about that. But I want to get back to the story of your family. Your biography states that your vast knowledge was handed down to you from 5 generations of master craftsmen. So I'd like to know about the passing of the knowledge and who were these people?
Sure. So far, I've been able to trace it back 5 generations to my great-great-grandfather, Krikor Tutounjian, and he was a textile manufacturer. He was a weaver, and his specialty was jacquard, also known as brocade type fabrics. Now, he used to, not only did he weave the fabric, but his um, sons and him would actually breed the silkworms. They had a mulberry tree nursery, and they would breed the silkworms and feed them in the nursery. And then his daughters and his wife would actually create the yarn, and then the sons would actually weave it. So this led to basically complete control over the entire process, and they made a beautiful product.
Mm-hmm.
So his son, Krikor, went to Lyon, France, which at that time was the textile capital of the world. This is, we're talking 1800s, late 1800s. And he learned how to do jacquard card punching, which is the programming of the machines of how they're going to weave the fabric.
Mm-hmm.
And he studied that there. And then he went back to his country at that time, which was Damascus. And he taught his 2 nephews how to do this process, this technology. And they grew up to become some of the best card punchers in the city of Damascus. And this is total family folklore, so I can't really say this is fact or not, but apparently they were so brilliant that they had the ability to expand the size of the repeat and hence be able to make more complex designs, and hence as a result were responsible for the boom of damask fabric.
Interesting.
So I don't know if you know, like, damask is basically a brocade that is made in Damascus, and if it was made in France, it would be called brocade. So again, I have no factual proof for this other than this is what was said around the coffee table at our family events. Um, but getting back to the story, so his niece at the time, who would have been my grandmother, was a seamstress. She had a sewing school, and she was an avid sewer. And he told her what he had experienced, what he witnessed in France, which was this process called pleating. And he explained to her what he had witnessed, what he had saw. And my grandmother was an incredibly industrious woman, and she started to do this and develop it to the point where she became very proficient at it. My grandmother became very proficient at pleating, and it was so financially rewarding that she would earn at that time the monthly salary, the average monthly salary, she would earn that in one day doing that.
Oh
So
my.
it was a very yeah. So it was a very secretive um it was a very secretive process for us because it basically was the family lifeline.
Hmm.
So she became so financially stable that as time went on, our family, the immediate family, started to migrate from textiles to pleating. And they developed a factory in the Middle East. And all we did was pleat and actually completely sew the garments.
Hmm.
Now, a key component in all of this is that my father's uncles were textile weavers. Um, One of them had a dyeing factory, and my grandfather, Tom, actually had a textile mill also. And my grandmother had a sewing school. And all four of these factories or activities were all happening in one location. And this is where my father grew up. So when my father was 5 years old, this is the environment that he grew up in. And as a result, he was able to draw all of this knowledge from all of these different tracks. And he is, how do you say, he is the one that really innovated and really pushed our family technology to the next level.
So you learned from your father then. Did this was this just something that started naturally when you were a child, or did you show great interest and decide this is what you wanted to do?
I had zero interest in this. As a matter of fact, I made every attempt to escape and run away. And I remember as a child, my father would always take me to work and, pat me on the back and say, son, one day you're going to take over the factory. And that thought to me was the equivalent of being dipped in boiling oil. So, but, you know, the way that I learned, I mean, I literally started learning when I was, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years old, just like my father. And it wasn't like this formalized, okay, son, today we're going to do this. It was more like, son, can you come here and help me? I need you. Please hold this, and no, don't hold it like that, son. Hold it like this. Whenever you do this, make sure you put your wrist like this, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is happening continually as the years are passing and not really realizing what I'm getting, the knowledge or the training that I'm getting. It took me pretty much 20 years to really figure out how much I knew, how much I had learned from my father. I actually had to leave the family business and go and do other things and talk to other professionals in the fashion industry before I realized just how much my father had taught me.
So I have two questions from that. First of all, you came to this country when you were 5. Tell us a little bit about your childhood outside of the family business. What was it like growing up around this, and what were some of the other things you did with your time?
Well, around that time, 5 years is pretty much, I would say, where I started to have the most conscious memories, I would say. And I grew up in New York City. My family came directly to New York City. And just like any normal child, it was basically go to school during the day. And on holidays or days where we didn't have school, it was go to the factory and play in the factory. And weekends were and holidays, were basically, it was interesting because, Thanksgiving at my house wasn't watching football, you know, it was the family was cooking and the men would be in the living room watching Clint Eastwood westerns, and they would be making molds. They would be making pleating molds. So, you know, everyone would kind of like help in the making of the mold. And also, when there were conversations, when family got together, the conversations were all around work, techniques, technology, you know, how one person took their weaving machine and was able to convert it into a towel weaving machine by doing this modification and that modification, or who invented a tool to make what particular job easier. And these are the things that they talked about. I mean, my family was obsessed with pleats, you know, and I I didn't realize I got the bug until very recently, or I should say in the later part of my life, I realized that I got the bug.
Well, that was my next question. How did you realize you got the bug? Because even though you knew this, it didn't mean you liked it. So what changed for you?
Um, there was a day when I had left the family business, and I was gone for several years trying to, you know, find my calling in life, doing what I felt passionate about. And it was, I would say, about 4 years of me looking. I did many different things, as you mentioned. And one day I came back to New York, and um, I saw my father and I saw my mother in the factory. And I realized that if I didn't step in and and take over, um, that that what would happen to their livelihood.
Mhm.
Um, and that's when I realized that if I don't continue this, then all of this generational knowledge would stop with my father.
Mm, mhm.
I have a brother, and he decided to take an alternate route. My brother, uh, you know, got more interested in the whole Wall Street thing, and he's involved in technology, and that's the route he chose. But for me, I really liked working with my hands, and really, the thing that I think made me love pleating is not necessarily pleating, but working with my father.
Mhm.
So I'm sorry if I'm sounding a little emotional, but I just lost my father.
George, I'm sorry. And look what you now carry on.
Thank you. Uh, so so basically, I realized that, you know, spending time and learning. I mean, everything that I have ever learned in this profession, I either learned directly from my father, or I learned it standing next to my father, doing it with him. So for me, this concept of, you know, family business, it's very much intertwined. It's like what you do with the people that you love, you know, kind of like all gets mixed in together.
Sure. Is there a next generation, George?
Unfortunately, I met my wife very late in life, and our we missed that boat. So the only thing would be if my brother's children decided to uh, get involved in this industry.
Mhm. Well, it's a beautiful story. Thank you so much for sharing all of that with us.
Thank you.
And you've talked about pleading, and that's been the lifeblood of all of this. Can you explain to us? It may be simplistic, but what is pleading, and why is it so important?
So pleading, to come up with a very sterile definition, is a systematic process of folding something. And this folding can either be um, symmetrical or non symmetrical types of folds.
Hmm.
So pleating, in my opinion, is very important because it both adds functionality to a garment in the sense that it allows for movement, and additionally it's a beautiful thing to look at.
Hmm.
When you see a woman who is walking towards you in a pleated garment that was pleated perfectly for that style, there's a certain feeling that overcomes you. You can see and feel the beauty in that. And at the end of the day, I mean, fashion is something that we do because it's an aesthetic drive. We want to look good. So, in my opinion, pleating definitely, complies with that urge.
There are numerous types of pleating. Would you tell us about some of them?
Sure. Um, Basically, let's start with this. There's two ways to pleat. I should say this. There's three ways to pleat. One of the ways to pleat is by hand, and that is a system that we don't necessarily do that much because it is something that, anyone can do. The other is with the use of machines, and the other is with the use of a mold. Now, if you think about classic pleating, and I wish I could show you visually, but if you can think about classic pleating, there's basically um, eight shapes of classic pleating. And that would be a straight accordion pleat, a straight side pleat, and a straight box pleat. Those would be your straight types of pleating, where the pleating is uniform up and down.
Hmm.
Then there is this shape that's called sunburst or starburst, and that's pleating from a circular type of a panel. And again, there's three types of sunburst pleating. There is accordion sunburst, sunburst side pleat, and sunburst box pleat. 90%, I will say, actually, 90% of what you see would be sunburst accordion. F- Let's just say 7 to 8% would be sunburst side pleat, and maybe 1 to 2% is your sunburst box pleat. Very, very
Hmm.
rare. And then you have A-line pleating. And A-line pleating is, again, it's like a side pleat or a box pleat that has a little bit of flair to it. Aside from that, you have another type of pleating, which is called fantasy pleating. And that type of pleating is a pleating that is very, very ornate, almost like origami. The
Hmm.
folding is
Hmm.
very elaborate. So the crease is not straight. The crease would actually go one direction, then go back another direction. And then last but not least, you have something that I would call under the umbrella of organic types of pleating. And those are pleating that look a little bit more, you know, mishmashy or, you know, tree barky
Hmm.
kind of a pleat.
Let's talk about how you took these different types of pleats and actually applied them. Now, you've worked with designers such as Coach, and there's a list here: Kevin Kline, Oscar De La Renta, Brandon Maxwell, Jason Wu, Vera Wang, J. Crew, Tory Burch. You've worked with Disney,
Hmm.
Gabriella Hearst, and Ralph Lauren. Can you tell us about a few of the special projects you did for them and why these specific projects stand out to you?
Yeah. So each one of these projects have their own story, some of them more so than others. But Coach was very interesting. When we first started working with Coach, we did the pleating for their entire women's wear collection. Their entire first season that they did women's wear, which was about, wow, 6, 7 years ago, was all pleating. So I personally was flattered that they chose us to do their entire collection pleating. Um, Calvin Klein, same thing. We've done a lot of great projects with Calvin Klein. We've done a lot of celebrities with Calvin Klein. Um, I mean, all of them to a certain extent. We do special projects with them, whether they be for a celebrity or a particular event or just regular sampling and production for these brands. All of
Hmm.
them have a different thing. I mean, I will say one project that was really, really intense was a project that we did for Coach. It was for the Met Gala, and it was for a celebrity. Her name was Chloe. What was her name? Her name was Chloe Grace Moretz. I don't
Hmm.
know if you know her, but that project was zero time to make it. And not only was it zero time to make it, but it was also barely enough fabric to complete the job or to do a test panel. And it was incredibly precise because they wanted a sunburst panel to be made, and they wanted it to have a trim stitched on it, and the trim had to be 100% level. And I'm sure you know that a bias circle skirt always stretches on the bias. So we had to figure out how much stretch needed to be there with basically no practice. So in no time, with no amount of wastage. So that was a very intense experience. But they always are. They always
but
are.
but you pulled it off.
But yes, we pulled it off with magic colors, and that's really what we're known for. We've developed a reputation for defying the laws of physics.
Many years of practice handed down
Yes,
through the family.
yes,
Um,
yes,
so, George, in addition to this, you've done restoration, reproduction of historical pieces for the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Dior.
yes.
Can you tell us about some of these pieces?
Sure. We did two projects for the Metropolitan Museum. One of them was for a designer named Charles James. It was for the Met Gala again, and the main garment that they were displaying for the Charles James exhibit was pleated. So we got to restore that garment, restore the pleating for that garment. So that was fascinating to see such an old, magnificent piece and to look inside under the hood, so to speak. For me, I love looking at these old garments because, I can see what these people were thinking and doing, when they were making this clothing. It's like I don't know, it's like a fortune cookie almost. I can see what was going on, and it's
Hmm.
fascinating to me. There was another project we did for the Metropolitan Museum, which was the recreation of certain garments that were made by a designer called Mariano Fortuny. I'm not sure if you're
Oh, yes, sure. Hmm.
good, good. So they had these garments, and they were very, very old, and they were they were basically falling apart, and they wanted to minimize the usage of these garments because they needed to be safely stored and not necessarily used and moved around a lot. So they asked us to recreate some of these garments, and I remember I when I went there, actually when they reached out to me, they sent me a sample of something, and they were like, "Here, just do this." And I was like, "Oh no, this is not good enough. I need to see an actual gown." And they were like, "Well, we can't do that. These things are very protected. We can't allow that." And I kind of was like bragging and boasting. Do you know who we are? Do you know what I'm talking about? How am I going to do this job if I don't see this? I have to
Hmm.
see it. So I remember I went with my father, and they had security there, and they brought the garment out, and we had to wear gloves, and my father was there and analyzing it, and the staff there at the Costume Institute, I mean, they saw my father, and it was obvious they had a tremendous amount of respect for him because they could see that my father knew what he was doing. And he said certain things, he observed certain things that we were like, how the hell did you know that? Um, but in any regards, we started working on it. We took our pictures, our documentation, and me and my father started talking about it. And I'm not sure if you know that this particular style of pleating is considered to be a secret technique that was lost. And it was unrecreatable.
Hmm.
And it was quite a challenge. And, we had to try all these different fabrics, all these different types of pleats. I mean, there was literally thousands of permutations of what could be done. And we had several months to pull it off. I think we had anywhere between 4 to 6 months to do this. And we kept on trying and trying and trying and trying and trying and trying. And then I got to the point where I was under so much stress that I was like, oh my God, I bragged so much. How, what am I, how can I show my face to these people again? And then one day my father came to work one morning and he said to me, I had a dream last night. I think let's try something. And we tried it and it basically worked. It was basically what he had thought. So based on that key concept, we continued to develop our samples with the right fabric, and we were able to create a pleat that looked so aesthetic, so beautiful that it was there hanging in the museum next to other Fortunis, and no one was able to tell that it wasn't a real Fortuny. So that was a pretty proud moment for me because, I mean, it was quite an accomplishment. And as a artisan, I definitely grew from that experience. Whenever you're under the gun and you are really have to comply and deliver your product, you really grow as a technical craftsman.
Indeed. Now, in addition to this, and your stories are wonderful, George, just what you have lived through and accomplished. In addition to this, you worked on television and movies, Gods of Egypt. You did some work for Stephen King's movie It, Mrs.
Yes.
Doubtfire, RuPaul's Drag Race, and one of my favorites, HBO's The Gilded Age. And you and I were talking before we started recording just about how stunning the costuming is in that show. Can you share any of the stories of some of the pieces you worked on in some of these productions?
Yes, yes. We definitely did some for the Gilded Age. I believe our character that it was made for was Bertha Russell. Um, that was, I must say, that the beauty of that show must go to the costume designers of that show because they did an amazing job. And all we did was just basically pleat some things for them to cut up and put on their app. All we did was just do some pleating for them to cut up and use on their wonderful costumes. But from a um, interesting perspective, I would say the Gods of Egypt was definitely a very fascinating experience. They reached out to us and they wanted this long, flowy cape to be done um, for the co-host. She was the Egyptian god of something. I forgot who she was, but this fabric was crazy. This fabric was the thinnest fiber that could possibly be made. And it was woven in the thinnest, lightest weave possible. Then the fabric was washed in a metallic copper uh, wash, which gave it this beautiful copperish glow to it. And then it was laser printed. It was digitally laser printed, but it was some kind of a special technology where you could only see the print on one side and you couldn't see the print if you flipped it on the other side. So
Hmm.
the fabric was transparent and it was very, very amazing. And it was quite expensive. I mean, the fabric was crazy. They required us in our factory to work on it with gloves. They didn't want us to touch the fabric because if we touched the fabric, the oil from our fingers would oxidize the fabric
Oh my,
and you could see green prints on it. And I believe they sent us half a roll, okay, half a roll of this fabric. And if I remember correctly, it was like $28,000 for the fabric.
oh my, oh my.
So we were all, shaking in our boots and making sure that we totally treated that fabric with kid gloves, literally.
Literally. So I have to ask you, out of everything that the stories you've shared with us and everything that you've done, the one thing that you did that fascinates me is you made your wife's wedding dress. Tell us
Yes.
about that.
That was also quite an adventure. So my wife, I said to her, listen, you know, you're not you're not wearing someone else's dress. So she's like, okay, that's great. She had a very practical viewpoint. She's like, one less thing I have to worry about. So I designed her dress, and she was living in another city at the time. She lived about 5 hours away from me. So it was hard for her to come in for fittings. And the day before the wedding, she was 3 sizes too small for the dress.
Mm.
So the day before, we had to completely pull this dress apart and reassemble it, and we barely finished the dress by, I think it was like 11 o'clock at night, and the next morning, we were actually getting on the plane to go. We eloped, actually, I should say, it was a destination wedding, and so we
Mhm.
had to travel, and so yeah, that was quite an interesting experience. Most people felt that how could you make your wife's wedding dress when, it's bad luck for the groom to see it? But I think that maybe in my case, if you make the dress, that rule doesn't apply.
Well, you didn't see it on her exactly
That's
until
true. That's
until the
true.
wedding.
Correct. Correct.
George, what's the most challenging thing about what you do?
Let's see. What's the most challenging thing? So I would say adhering to the old world methods of producing product, producing garments in a city that is getting more and more hmm, moving out of this manufacturing age.
Hmm. Mhm.
I would say that's the most challenging thing I'm confronted with every day is the fact that, how do we maintain this standard of clothing manufacturing in a world where, you know, things like fast fashion
Mhm.
and, AI and robotics are starting to, um, you know, affect every portion of our life.
Sure, a loss of craftsmanship.
Yes, very much so. Very much so.
So many of our listeners are sewists. What's the most important thing you want them to know about your work, and what's important for them to keep in mind as they create pieces which need to be pleated?
So I would say the most important thing is that there is a lot to know about pleating and to not refrain from reaching out to us and asking us what they want to do, what they want to accomplish. This is really the biggest thing. This is the
Hmm.
biggest thing I would say that, you should lean on us for our technical experience because that question is loaded. Like, based on what type of pleating you choose and what style it is, would determine how you have to tackle that project.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
So talk to you before they start, not when they're halfway into it or done and say, "Hmm, this needs some pleats."
Absolutely, absolutely. Because there's two totally different kinds of approaches to pleat. So you have the type of pleating that most sewers would do themselves by hand, whether they be at home or even a sample maker here in the garment center. But then there is professional pleating, and professional pleating is done with a different viewpoint in mind. And there's different techniques that people do. And if you're not a pleater, you don't necessarily understand what you need to do. It's just a giant mystery.
Mhm.
And so people kind of invent their own solutions of what they think they need. So I would say if you are going to pleat something, it would be great for you to reach out to us so that you know exactly what you need to do because it's really not that complicated. It's actually quite simple. If you know how to tackle it, it's quite simple.
And at the end of this podcast, we'll, tell people how they can find you. George, tell us about Project Golden Bear.
So Project Golden Bear is my initiative, something that we started talking about when my father was alive, which kind of addresses the issue of the decline of craftsmanship that's going on in the world today. The generation that has a tremendous amount of experience is slowly starting to retire and pass, and the new generation is not necessarily or hasn't necessarily been interested in doing this kind of a craft. And even the ones that are interested don't really have the environment to put in their reps, so to speak.
Hmm.
So, you know, there's a lot of students that go to school, but when they come out of school, it's a lot of theory without a lot of actual practice. So, Project Golden Bear is our creation of the apprenticeship model, where we are piloting it right now with one high school student from the High School of Fashion Industries. And she comes here and she cuts by hand a singular product, which happens to be a golden teddy bear, over and over again. And she gets her reps in so that she can develop the hand eye coordination between her hand and the scissors
Hmm.
and start to really master the first skill of what we feel is the most important thing if you are going to become a designer, which is to be able to cut your own product properly.
Why did you name it Golden Bear?
It kind of happened by accident because, we naturally have a lot of scraps of fabrics because we work with all these high-end designers, and there's always scraps, and they're so beautiful and they're so expensive, and we can't bring ourselves to throw it away. So we would always keep them, and then we would try and make certain products with them. And we've done several things. And then, the issue with making a product is it going to fit? Is this person going to like it, et cetera, et cetera. And so I tested a whole bunch of things. And one day I said, you know what? Let me make something that is doesn't have any sizing issues, doesn't have any gender issues, doesn't have any, like, it's just a teddy bear. Who doesn't love a teddy bear? So I said, let me cut a gold teddy bear. And I cut it and I showed it to some people and they lost their mind when they saw it. It was just like, oh my God, what is that? And I was like, oh wow, look at that. There's something there. And more and more people would see it laying around the factory and they're like, oh my God, what is it? I must have that. I must have that. And then I just started referring to it as the Golden Bear Project, the
Hmm.
Golden Bear Project. And, always thinking like, what are we going to name this thing? And then the next thing you know, I was like, you know what? It named itself.
Hmm.
So another aspect of the Golden Bear, which gives it a little bit of significance, is that, you know, the first person I gave it to, um, unfortunately passed from cancer.
Hmm.
And there was a girl who was part of this, one of her friends, uh, one of our mutual friends, and she saw it and she said, that gold is the color of children's cancer. And I said, oh, I had no idea. And it kind of like one thing led to another. And then I just decided that, you know what, the ideal scene is that you purchase one of these bears, which is basically designed to finance the education of this person and also to create work when there are lulls in the garment industry. And if you were to buy one, then one bear would be given to a child with cancer, because my friend has a non for profit that she started because her child did have cancer. So we are basically in the infancy stages of this whole process. And we did start giving some bears out to these children, and the reactions have been quite heartwarming, I should say. It's quite amazing when you see a child who, is opens this package and sees this beautiful thing that traditionally is just made of, cheap fabric and whatever, but now they're getting a piece of something that went down the runway, a remnant of something that went down the runway, a very expensive, beautiful garment, and it's being upcycled, and it's being upcycled for an amazing cause.
We'll make sure to ask about how people can find out more about this when we conclude this show. There's a movie out. This is April of 2024, and there's a new movie coming out this month called Fallout, for which you did some work. Tell us about that.
Yes, so this is a new movie that's coming out on Amazon. It should be out very shortly, and it's based on a video game. And in this space age, it's kind of like a space age futuristic post apocalyptic type of a film. And most of the soldiers or whoever they are, I mean, I haven't seen the movie to really know what they are. I'm dying to see the movie. But most of the people in there are wearing this blue jumpsuity type of a thing. And we did the pleating detailing for these outfits.
So it'll be special for our listeners who see the movie. They'll know a few little things behind the scenes.
Correct.
George, what's next for you? What's your dream?
What is my dream? Well, next, there are many things that are next. Um, One is to fully launch Project Golden Bear. The next one after that would be to relaunch the family brand. What most people don't know is that of the 93 years, I believe it's been now, since the 93 years that we have been pleading, most of that time, about 85% of that time, we only pleaded for ourselves, meaning that we did everything. The designing of the product, the pleading, the manufacturing, the distribution. And it was all done under a label that my father had created with my mother. And it was called Pierre Labiche. And it was always my father's dream to relaunch the family brand. So that is what is next. And that is my dream. My dream is to be able to relaunch that and showcase my father's brilliance and get my father the recognition that he deserves for being an incredible innovator in the field of pleading.
And that's Pierre Laviche. And
Pierre Labiche.
we'll look forward to that. George, in everything we talked about, is there something I didn't ask you that you wish I had?
No, you've actually been incredibly thorough in your questions. Quite amazing.
Well, I so appreciate your time today. Your stories and history of your family have just been wonderful. I think we're smarter about pleading, and I think we'll recognize it a little bit more when we see it in front of us and in the movies and on Broadway. So thank you so much for spending time with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
George, if people want to reach out to you, and we're going to do this on two levels. First of all, if they want to reach out to you, how do they do that? And secondly, how do they find out more about Project Golden Bear?
So, to reach out to me, there are several ways. One is you can just go to our website. Our website is internationalpleading.com, or they could go to our Instagram, which is at internationalpleading, or they can send an email to info@internationalpleading.com, and they can just put in the subject line, "Attention George."
Okay, and how do they find out more about Project Golden Bear? Would they contact you directly, or is there a special website to go to?
So there will be a website. It's being built as we speak, and the website domain is Project Golden Bear.
Perfect. Perfect. And thank you again so very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, there you have it. Another story about someone just like you. Someone for whom sewing or quilting, or in this case, pleating, is so much more than a hobby. It has become a way of life and a connection to something bigger. If you know someone you think has an outstanding story, a story that should be shared on this podcast, please drop me a note to meg@soandsopodcast.com or complete the form on our website. Be sure to subscribe to, review, and rate this podcast on your favorite platform, and visit our website, soandsopodcast.com, for more information about today's and all of our guests. That's SEWANDSO podcast.com. And finally, I want to thank Bernina for making this program possible. I'm Meg Goodman, and I look forward to you joining us next time on So and So.